The tradition of ironing bread in old America. You wake up in a small wooden house, nestled among wheat fields that aren't in a rush to grow. The morning breeze whispers like a great-grandmother you've never met. The air smells like yeast and handmade soap, and everything feels like the first page of an old notebook just opened. Outside, the chickens crow with a confidence they've never questioned. Inside, the soft crackle of wood coals in the stove sounds like a conversation that expects no reply. Welcome to 19th century America, more specifically, a farmer's kitchen where one thing is cherished above all: ironed bread. Yes, you heard that correctly. Ironed like a shirt, but crispier and edible. And yes, this will be a long evening journey. You may not make it past today. Before we go further, if your eyes are still open and Haven tea been swept away by the warmth of coals and floating flour, consider liking and subscribing to this channel. Tell us in the comments where you're re-listening from and what time sleep started tapping on your shoulder. We love guessing who fell asleep the fastest tonight. Let's begin tonight's journey. You're sitting on a kitchen stool. Its creak in sync with your breath. In front of you, an old woman, not ancient, but wise enough to know every yeast secret lifts a cast iron flat iron off the stove. Not electric, mind you. This thing is heavy, soot-covered, and capable of killing a mouse with a lazy drop. She unwraps a cloth napkin. Inside are pieces of white bread, hardened overnight. Bread is never thrown out. Of course, that would be a crime. Bread must be warmed, flattened, smoothed. And that's why she gently presses the iron against it, like a sculptor coaxing meaning from marble. The historical fact here: in the 19th century, cast iron flat irons weren't just for clothes. Families used them to heat food, sterilize cloth, and flatten love letters to remove excessive emotion. Total multi-tool. Strange cultural tidbit. Some New England families believed ironing bread could remove lazy spirits. It's unclear whether that was a metaphor or just a jab at their teenagers. And yes, historians still debate whether this tradition came from limited kitchenware or a universal human love of heating things with heavy objects. Both are plausible. But let's not argue. We're here to drift off, not defend a thesis. The iron lifts. The bread lets out a gentle steam, like it's sighing in relief. You smell wheat and hot metal. And somehow, that's deeply calming. You find yourself back in that kitchen the next morning. Or maybe you just woke up from a half-baked dream. Time doesn't matter here. What matters is the sound of crisp bread fibers being sliced diagonally, because of course no one cuts square bread in this house. That's too modern. Too symmetrical? The old woman, now lovingly dubbed Mother Bread in your head, begins another tale as she irons a fresh slice. Her voice is scratchy like a flour-covered diary. You know, she says while pressing gently, my grandmother used to iron bread to make it taste like it was just baked. It was 2-day-old bread. 2-day-old bread. Today, we'd call that emergency toast or bread pudding material. But back then, it was survival or art or some quiet village mom competition. Who could make the same loaf feel new every day? Today's historical fact: Bread in the 19th century was often baked only once a week. No fresh loaves each morning, lest you had your own oven and the time, energy, and patience to mix, wait, and bake while keeping your children from eating the dough. Another weird cultural note. In some Pennsylvania Dutch communities, bread that was too soft was considered immoral. They believed bread should be as firm as one's character. Soft bread equals soft mind. Honestly, my sourdough would be offended. And as always, history offers its charming confusion. Some scholars believe the bread ironing habit came from sailor biscuit drying techniques. Others say it was just winter boredom. Maybe both. Maybe neither. Maybe someone just put a hot iron on bread because their baby was crying, and tradition was born from desperation. One thing is for sure. The smell of warmed bread with just a kiss of scorch from iron is like a hug from the past. Today is a bit windier. You hear the rustle of corn leaves, like tiny flags from a country that only believes in carbohydrates. You're wearing a worn-out apron that smells like old lard and a hint of triumph. On the kitchen table, something new. A bowl of hardened butter in copper. You know it's butter because there's a hand-scrawled chalk label reading BUTR on the side. The missing E is either a mistake or a protest against vowels with aristocratic airs. Mother Bread tells you to try it. You pick up the butter knife, which is sharper than expected, and attempt to spread a dab onto the freshly ironed bread. The sound of cold butter scraping warm toast is like the first rain on a tin roof. Maybe not everyone finds it beautiful, but you suddenly feel like a poet. Historical fact for today: homemade butter was often stored in copper or clay stone bowls and preserved with coarse salt. Sometimes it came out slightly orange, not from dye, but from cows eating wild carrots. Like butter, history isn't always white. Weird cultural tidbit. In Appalachia, butter was once rubbed on a child's ears to calm tantrums. Not symbolically, literally. If you're still angry after buttered ears, you might not be human, said one local newspaper in 1872. And here we are, trying to understand a world where bread is ironed and butter goes to unexpected places. As always, historians still debate whether butter was really used as therapy or simply there was just too much butter lying around. When you take your first bite of iron butter toast, it tastes like ambitionless history. Slightly scorched, a bit salty, but warm. And that's what matters. This morning, you decide to ask. Your voice is soft, barely louder than the clink of freshly washed plates. Why not just rebake the bread? Mother Bread looks at you as if you asked why rainwater, isn't seasoned. Because, she says slowly, the heat from an iron touches bread the way people touch each other. More personal. And you? Not sure how to argue with that? Simply nod. In the corner of the kitchen sits a wooden shelf with a collection of failed breads, too thin, too scorched, or curved like a shy smile. Says Mother Bread. But they're never thrown out. They're used for supper, or for chickens, or turned into moral tales. Today's historical fact. Leftover bread was often made into bread pudding, or fried in butter and syrup. Nothing went to waste. Even crumbs were folded into the next dough. Some old recipes even requested crumbs from a day not too cold as if weather shaped destiny. Strange cultural trivia. A Kansas newspaper ad from 1884 once claimed a soap could remove iron marks from your bread, which raises two questions. Why were there marks? And why was that a problem? And as usual, history scholars are baffled. Were iron marks on bread really a thing, or just soap marketing inventing a crisis? Much like most modern advertising. You take a slice from the failed bread pile. The taste, wonderful. Like a misunderstanding that ends in a hug. You chew slowly, hear birds at the window, and realize the world doesn't need to be perfect to be delicious. There are days when bread isn't enough. Today is one of them. The grain bin is empty, and even the chickens walk around with suspicious expressions, as if they know they might be the next meal. So you, with slow steps and a mildly hungry heart, are tasked with making shadow bread. What is shadow bread? Of course you ask. It's bread that isn't really there, says Mother Bread, handing you a bowl of warm water and a pinch of flour only visible in certain light. With careful movements, you begin mixing imaginary dough. Its texture is like a forgotten nightmare, slightly sticky, deeply ambiguous. You pat it onto a flat pan, and since there's no iron today's, a sun-heated stone instead. The smell that rises? Something like false hope and a hint of salt. Historical fact of the day. During times of famine, many families made mock breads, blending flour, water, and sometimes with dust or bitter roots. Not to fill the belly, but to keep up the illusion that dinner still meant something. Weird cultural tidbit. In parts of 1800s Missouri, parents crafted fake bread out of clay, painting it with natural dyes so children could feel like they were part of the meal. It sounds sad because it is sad. And as usual, scholars still debate whether shadow bread was ever eaten or just played with like edible doll's tools for psychological survival. You hold your shadow bread. You even try biting it. There's no taste, of course. But in that silence, there's a surprising peace. Perhaps fullness isn't always about the stomach. Today, you learn something more important than ironing technique. You learn about the night bread ritual. It's not a party. There are no invitations. Just a handful of neighbors quietly stepping into the kitchen as the sun dips low, each bringing the last piece of their bread to combine in a single large bowl. The idea, your old neighbor whispers, is that one slice isn't enough. But 10 slices from 10 houses might make a proper dinner. You sit on a sack of wheat, plush like a dusty beanbag, and watch as they dip tiny pieces into a thin broth that tastes like memory and little else. But everyone nods seriously, as if it's the best dish of the year. And maybe it is. Historical fact today. In 19th century rural America, communities often held round dinners, where food was shared among households to make sure everyone had at least a bite. Sometimes called potluck of despair, half joke, half salvation. Odd cultural note. In New England, a pastor in 1811 wrote that he felt the presence of God most clearly while eating hard bread with old widows in the winter. Probably not because of the flavor. Of course, historians still debate whether this ritual was a quiet act of economic resistance or just an excuse to gossip while chewing. You dip your bread in the broth. The taste is still dull, but you feel full because you're not alone. And in a world like this, that's quietly revolutionary. You're awakened this morning, not by a rooster, not by church bells, but by the sound of someone blowing flour. A ritual that, frankly, sounds like a sneeze in slow motion. At the edge of the table, a young boy blows a handful of flour into the air, then watches it fall with victorious eyes. That's how we know if the harvest god approves of our morning dough. He explains, as if reciting the laws of physics. Today is offering day. The ironed bread will be decorated with unmilled grains, peanut husks, and surprisingly a dried mint leaf from last season. Its shape is strange, like a pizza run over by a bicycle. But the intention is pure. Historical fact of the day, some 18th century. Farming communities believed that blowing flour into the air before baking would bring luck and help the bread breathe. A slightly dramatic metaphor for a hunk of carbs. Strangely, in parts of Kansas, people hung dried bread over their doors like mistletoe for weary farmer spirits. They called it guardian loaf. And yes, modern culinary experts still argue whether this was just a distraction from the fact their bread rarely rose. As you iron your bread today, you carve a sun symbol in the middle with the back of a spoon. No clear reason, just because you can. And maybe, sometimes, beauty is found in the little liberties we take inside the dullest routines. Today, you learn. Bread can be a love letter. Yes, in a world without stamps or cell service, a slightly overbaked loaf is the best way to say, "Sorry, I stole your wheat last week." And if you drizzle a little honey in the center, that might mean, "Please forgive me." Also, I like your smile. Today, you see a young girl slip a thin piece of bread under the barn door. On its surface is a small carving, 2 circles and a line. Your friend whispers that that's a love symbol only readable by someone who's gone to market 3 times in 1 week. Historical fact today, some 19th century farming communities used carved symbols on bread as secret communication systems, especially during harvest season when in-person visits were rare. A flower shape meant a request for help. Star meant good news. Strangely, a writer in 1858 claimed he received a marriage proposal in the form of 2 differently colored loaves, wrapped in corn husks. Not conventionally romantic, but technically edible. And as always, historians disagree on whether these messages were intentional codes, or just the accidental doodles of bored children stuck in the kitchen. You hold your bread more carefully today. Who knows, someone might be reading your feelings through the warm lines on its crust. There's one thing that never changes: the smell of warm bread filling a home. Today, you wake up a little earlier, not from duty, but from gentle curiosity. The kitchen is still dark, but someone's already lit the fire. The first loaf today isn't for the family. It's for ... the birds. In your village, there's an annual tradition called Mourning for the Sky. People make thin loaves shaped like bird wings and hang them from small trees. They believe if birds eat them, the harvest will be plentiful. And if the birds ignore them, well, at least breakfast is ready. Historical fact today: in some early American Midwest farming communities, people made special bread offerings to birds every spring asking for protection over their fields. Birds that visited were seen as good omens, especially those noisy starlings. In an 1833 diary, one farmer noted that birds only came if the bread was buttered. That may have been the beginning of the spoiled bird movement. This tradition, of course, has no scientific basis. Some experts even claim the birds were just bored. But aren't we all? You hang your bread from the plum tree behind your house. Then you sit quietly, waiting for a bird to come. But in that silence, you realize, sometimes what you need isn't a sign but the chance to sit and quietly hope. Today, you feel a little sentimental about flour, not for its taste or its shape, but for the memory. You find a small pouch of old flour left from the previous season. Its color is slightly off, as if it absorbed the scent of autumn. But you use it anyway. Nostalgia bread, someone calls it. It tastes like a story left unfinished. Today, you bake a tiny loaf no bigger than your hand. Not for eating, but for keeping by the window. That's where your grandmother used to place her reminder bread. A little loaf meant to remind you that something once happened. Historical fact today, some farming families kept small pieces of bread from significant events: births, deaths, first harvests, and dried them by the window. Never eaten, just seen. A kind of family bread museum. A record from 1871 mentions a mother who kept bread from each child's first birthday. When her house burned down, she only grabbed two things: the Bible and a jar of old bread. Historians still debate whether this was truly about memory or just an excuse not to waste food. Today, you save your tiny loaf and you feel lighter, as if you've preserved time in the shape of thin crust and quiet air pockets. And in the silence of night, that time feels like enough. Tonight, you hear a small clink from the kitchen. Not loud, just enough to make you get up and walk slowly. Cross floorboards groaning like an old man rising from his rocking chair. On the table, there it is, the old iron, left cool but still glowing faintly from recent use. Beside it, a small round loaf, looking like it just had its hair done. In your community, ironing bread isn't just a habit. It's an art. People believe a smooth surface makes bread more polite for guests. Some even say wrinkled bread leads to awkward conversations. Perhaps that's why your grandfather stayed silent during dinners. His rolls were poorly ironed. Tonight's historical fact. In 19th century parts of Central America, party bread was often ironed with flat, hot tools to create a sense of symmetry and kitchen elegance, a kind of grooming session for the bread. A letter from 1858 even suggests that rippled bread reveals unrest in the soul. Bread psychology apparently predated Freud's decision to overcomplicate everything. You touch the handle of the iron. Now cool. Feels like touching a past that wasn't in a hurry. And that night, you sit quietly with the overly smooth loaf, as if guarding a family heirloom you can technically eat. You step outside with bread in your hand. Tonight is a low sky, night clouds hanging like damp linen sheets forgotten on the line. In the center of the yard, you place the bread atop a large stone, then sit on an old wooden bench that seems to know every secret in the village. There's a local belief that bread left out overnight can absorb dreams. Not just yours, but anyone's who passes by. People call it cross-dream bread. In the morning, you slice it, share it, and hope for someone else's dream. Sometimes the results are delightful. Sometimes you dream of cows. Today's fact. In parts of old Appalachia, people left bread outside their windows to catch nightmares, a kind of carb-based dream catcher, possibly ineffective, but significantly more delicious. A 1904 journal records a boy dreaming he could fly after eating dream night bread. But he merely fell out of bed. Scientists are still unsure if this counts as evidence or just gravity. You sit there, watching the bread in silence. A soft breeze passes, and you swear you saw the loaf twitch slightly. But maybe that's just hope. Or maybe bread has dreams too. Morning arrives like someone who knocks on the door but doesn't wait for an answer. You wake slowly, the bread from last night still on the stone, now slightly soggier, as if it dreamed too hard. Today, you decide to visit Aunt Hester, the only person in town who still keeps an antique bread iron in a wooden cabinet, alongside recipe books that contain more life advice than actual instructions. One recipe even begins: if your heart is unsettled, do not start the dough. As you sit in her narrow yet sunlit kitchen, she serves tea that tastes like the past sweet, but with a hint of spice that makes you question its expiration date. She tells stories of the days when ironing bread was part of wedding preparation, and a bride was considered unready if she couldn't tea-smooth a loaf without scorching the crust. Today's historical fact. In agrarian communities of the 1800s, ironing bread was sometimes part of a young woman's readiness test for marriage, alongside sewing and jam making. Though, according to Aunt Hester, some men just cared if the bread was warm. There's an old joke she still remembers. If your bread burns, maybe you do too. She chuckles to herself. You laugh too, half because it's funny, half because it might be true. As the sun begins to dip again, you walk home with a piece of bread and a little wisdom that is too hot to handle when fresh. Today is market day. You walk among rows of cloth, baskets of eggs, and a man selling soap that he says can also be used as sauce, but shouldn't. At the end of the dirt lane, you find a small stall labeled bread irons, for sale, not intended for modern use. The vendor is an old woman with sharp eyes and a smile like folded linen. She offers you an old iron with tiny flower engravings on the handle. This one once pressed bread for a governor's banquet, she says. You're not sure if it's true, but the story feels baked into the iron itself. Today's fact. In 1912, one area of New England held an annual speed bread ironing contest, broadcast on local radio and judged by the Bakers Guild. Sadly, the event was discontinued after one tragic incident involving wool gloves and an overly hot cornbread. At the side of the booth, there's a small sign: no wrinkled bread. Prices follow suit. You buy the iron not because you need it, but because you want to. And maybe, secretly, because you wish to be part of a small history that doesn't make it into textbooks. You wrap it carefully, as though carrying someone's dream fragment. Then you walk home, thinking that some traditions aren't meant to continue, but they're beautiful to remember. Night falls like a thin layer of butter on toast that's no longer warm, smooth, soft, and almost silent. You sit near the window, watching the stars stir behind the curtain of sky, like crumbs of light from a forgotten banquet. In your lap, the bread iron you bought earlier still holds a hint of warmth, as if the metal object knows it has found purpose again, if only as a story. On the table, a loaf of bread sits prepared not for eating, but simply to be shanbi, 'cause not every food must end in the stomach. Some are meant to nourish memory instead. You light the oil lamp. The golden-orange glow reflects off the iron surface. You imagine the gentle hiss it once made when pressed against dough, like the sound of someone exhaling before saying something important, ... or something funny, depending on the moment. And in the hush of your nighttime home, you begin to think about all the things that were once considered important. Ironing bread, polishing shoes with bananas, storing rainwater in bird-pattern jars, tying hair with corn husk ribbons. All of it may sound strange today, but in their time, each was a part of love, hope, or simply a way to make it through. Historians still debate whether ironing bread ever had real culinary value, or if it endured only as a ritual because, well, people like routines they can repeat. A gentle night breeze drifts in, carrying the faint scent of yeast and old recipe books. You yawn and think perhaps the world hasn't really changed. Just the way we express care has shifted its shape. Bread may no longer be ironed, but we're still trying to smooth things out. Emotions, memories, crumpled days. And like the old bread iron, some things are no longer used, but still kept, because their shape reminds us of what we once cared about. The light fades, sleep comes,